panel to speak about this topic with Jack Dunford. Jack has founded the Burmese Border Consortium in the 80s and has been the executive director of the BBC until 2012. We have also Sally Thompson. Sally joined the Burmese Border Consortium in 1991, and she's the executive director since 2012. Now the organization has changed the name. It's called the Border Consortium, TBC. We have also Cham Tong. Cham Tong is a teacher by training, and she's a representative of the Shan Human Rights Foundation. And we have Dr. Cynthia Maung. Dr. Cynthia is a medical doctor. She left Burma in 1988, just after the repression by the military government. She went into Thailand, and in 1989 she founded the Maeto clinic in Mae Sot, and now the Maeto clinic is still existing, and it's a large hospital which is receiving on average 400, 500 patients every day. So if please the speaker can take the seats. And we will start with a presentation by Jack Dunford.
Good evening. This is working. Welcome, and thank you for coming this evening. Back in the early 1980s, I was working with Indo-Chinese refugees for the Church of Christ in Thailand, including these huge camps of up to 150,000 refugees on the Cambodian border. We were in the middle of the Cold War. This was the first major humanitarian crisis to get global attention. The whole world knew about the Indo-Chinese refugees. Burma, in contrast, had been in self-imposed isolation for decades. Foreigners had been kicked out. Visas were limited to 7 days. Few people knew and seemingly cared much about what was going on there. When refugees began to arrive from Burma in Dak province in 1984, I find myself in a van heading for Mae Sot with a few other NGO workers on a look-see visit at the request of the Thai government. We had been asked to take care of around 10,000 Karen refugees for a few months. We were told they would go home at the end of the dry season. None of us on that trip knew very much about Burma, let alone the Karen. And when asking around, people would respond rather vaguely and in rather judgmental terms, talking about rebels and insurgents and drugs and guns. Definitely not something to get involved in. We arrived here in Mae La camp on the 6th of March, 1984. For those of you familiar with Mae La today, this was over the other side of the mountain, which now forms the spectacular backdrop to the camp. It seemed pretty much like an ordinary hill tribe village, but immediately I was struck by the almost eerie silence as the refugees quietly went about their daily chores. Whilst we handed out some token supplies, this was the first TBC rice distribution. There was a strange disconnect between these seemingly gentle people and the images we had been given. of rebels and insurgents and drugs and guns. There were very few modern books on Burma at the time. Most of them were from the British period, about World War II, and the romanticized stories about the hill people. The first contemporary book I found was the just published US Army Burma Country Study, from which I got my first history lesson. I learned how a low-intensity civil war had been waging almost since independence in 1948, and that Burma had been ruled by a military dictatorship under General Ne Win since 1962. In those days, the nature of the Civil War was, and generally still is, little understood, but can be best explained by these two maps. As shown on the left, Burma is extraordinarily ethnically diverse, with 135 official languages. There are a dozen or so major ethnic groups and a multitude of other smaller ethnic groups, and these mostly inhabit the mainly mountainous border areas of the country. The dominant Burmans, shown in white, occupied the central areas along the Irrawaddy and Sitang river floodplains. It is important to note that the ethnic nationalities have been here for millennia, long before the modern colonial boundaries were drawn up. Whilst the ethnic Burmans are relative newcomers, supposedly coming down from the area of Tibet around the 9th century AD. Each of the ethnic groups had their own language, religions, cultural traditions, and systems of governments, some of them having quite sophisticated government structures. In today's terms, these ethnic areas were, in effect, sovereign states. A simplified history of Burma over the last 1,000 years is how, under Burmese kings and then Burmese armies, the Burmese armies attempted to establish control over the entire country, whilst all of the ethnic nationalities at some stage have taken up arms to defend their territories. From 1962, General Ne Win ruled the country with an iron fist, waging war against the ethnic nationalities under a counterinsurgency strategy known as the Four Cuts. This strategy aimed to cut off the ethnic armies from their families and the villagers who provided their food, their funding, their intelligence, and their recruits. The ethnic nationalities want some kind of federal state system, which formed the basis of the original British independence agreement, and which is reflected by the current political map on the right-hand side of this slide. The ethnic nationalities want some semi-autonomous ethnic states with control over their own resources, education, etc., whilst being part of a federal union. Although there has been some devolution of power, even today these are still little more than just lines on a map, with the Burmese army always firmly under control. The result was a low-intensity civil war throughout the country, peaking in the 1970s when half the country was in a state of insurgency. But gradually, Ne Win was winning this war, overrunning territory and pushing the resistance back towards the borders. There were several attempts at peace talks, but all were doomed to failure because the word federalism was anathema to Ne Win, who wanted total control in the name of unity. One army, the elimination of all resistance, Burmanization of the whole country. It took decades for Ne Win to progress this war because the border states are vast and mainly mountainous, difficult to establish safe supply lines from the interior. The ethnic armies, in comparison, were familiar with their own terrain, experienced at surviving in the malarial jungles, and had shorter supply lines. In 1984, the ethnic armies still maintained control over most of the orange shaded areas on this map. But that dry season, the Burmese army managed to break through the Karen front lines, sending the first 10,000 refugees into Thailand. Of course, the refugees did not go back that year, but more kept coming. And we soon realized that the Burmese army intended to overrun the entire Karen state. They had secured their supply lines and able to expand their offensive each dry season. New waves of refugees arrived in Thailand every week. We heard constant harrowing tales of how the Burmese army had entered villages, killing, raping, burning rice farms, and taking livestock. Refugees fleeing to Thailand with their families, able to bring only what meager possessions they could carry in their arms. Refugee numbers increased every year, and our aid program grew, delivering rice to more and more refugees. Although this went on almost unnoticed by the international community, we were still in the shadow of the Cold War. Burma briefly hit the international headlines for a few days in 1988, when the Burman people themselves rose up against the regime. And this is when Aung San Suu Kyi came to prominence as the leader of the democracy movement. But the uprising was quickly crushed, and a second military dictator, Shan Maung, took over. Western nations, led by the United States, imposed sanctions, but Shan Maung promised elections, opened up the economy a little bit, and Asian countries were soon willing to do business with SLORC, the new junta. The situation for the ethnic nationalities just got worse. Thailand seized the opportunity to negotiate contracts with Shan Maung to exploit border resources, seriously undermining the ethnic economies and their security. And Shan Maung announced that he would crush the ethnic assistance within 2 years, launching yet another massive offensive all along the border. Sorry, seem to have jumped one. Okay, we jumped a slide. Now we had, here we go. There we had Karenni refugees arriving in the north, in Mae Sot province, and Mon refugees arriving in the middle of the border at Three Pagodas Pass. We have a slightly slow response here. Something weird is happening here. Although we were not involved on other borders, over 250,000 Rohingya refugees also fled to Burma, to Bangladesh in 1992. In what many saw as a coup, Shan Maung retired in 1992, and yet another military dictator, Than Shwe, took over. Than Shwe proved to be a brilliant strategist, again promising new beginnings, including peace talks with the ethnic nationalities. And many in the international community believed that something positive was happening. But once again, nothing had really changed. The Burmese army soon launched another major new offensive along the Thai Burmese border. And in January 1995, the Burmese army overran the crucially important Karen headquarters at Manaplo. This was a huge loss for the ethnic struggle that resulted in the entire central section of the border falling in 1995. In 1996, Karenni and Shan areas were occupied in the north, and in 1997, another offensive overran the Karen areas in the south. In 3 short years, the entire border had been overrun. We had 100,000 refugees by now, and the ethnic armies no longer controlled any significant territory. But the border population was still sympathetic to the resistance, and we began to hear news of the forced relocation of villages throughout the border states. The numbers were huge, hundreds of thousands of people being displaced over a wide area. Our information, of course, came from the ethnic groups themselves and could not be independently verified. The international community often greeted our pleas for assistance with skepticism. Sally and I drew this crude map showing the areas that we heard were affected for an international meeting that I was attending in Washington in 1997. We estimated that at least 600,000 people had already been affected. What was happening was that whole village tracts, 10 villages in this example, were being ordered to move at short notice with the threat of being shot as insurgents if they did not get out. They were forced to move to resettlement sites without assistance or compensation. And once they left, their villages were burned to the ground. In the resettlement sites, the displaced villagers were forced to live under curfew, and this is where some of the worst human rights abuses took place: rape and torture, and where the population was subjected to forced labor. In some cases, the displaced villagers were forced to build their own stockades, and they were forced to build roads and grow crops for the army. Most dangerous of all, they were forced to serve as porters, carrying supplies for soldiers in the conflict areas. Unpaid and starving, many perished as they got sick or attempted to run away. Others died as human minesweepers. Every year, tens of thousands of people were fleeing from the Burmese army, looking for safe havens, often being displaced many times over. By 2006, we were able to produce detailed documentation of the displacement, and our data was generally being recognized by the international community. According to our surveys, during the 10 years to 2006, over 3,000 villages were relocated or destroyed, displacing at least 1 million people. The refugee population in Thailand had reached 150,000, which was the highest level we recorded, because around this time, the Thai government began allowing refugees to go for resettlement in the United States and other countries, and therefore balancing out any new arrivals. The ethnic states were now effectively occupied by a foreign army. About 40% of the entire Burmese army frontline troops were now based in the border states. Like Ne Win, pursuing a counterinsurgency campaign, targeting civilians in contravention of international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, exploitation of the border natural resources continued, unabated, and all under bilateral agreement with the Burmese army, the ethnic nationalities having no say in decisions made and no share in any proceeds as their ancestral lands were being grabbed. A network of new military bases now stretched throughout the border states. And a brutal army of occupation was now able to maraud with impunity, bringing fear and suffering to the local population. Death if they got in the way. This was the grim situation when a general election was held in 2010, and Aung San Suu Kyi was released after years of house arrest. A new constitution guaranteed the military control, and for most observers, there was little room for optimism. But after a landmark meeting between the new military leader, Thein Sein, and Aung San Suu Kyi, an unprecedented new peace process was launched. For the first time in almost 40 years, it was allowed to discuss federalism. Cautious optimism became the name of the game, leading to a series of highly publicized ceasefires with many of the ethnic nationalities. When I left TVC in 2013, about 80,000 refugees had left Thailand for resettlement overseas, but 130,000 remained on the border. With a seemingly more benign military leader in charge and an international community keen to restore normal relations, withdraw sanctions, and get on with business, preparations were beginning for refugees to go home. For me, the dream of a federal state system was always the obvious and preferred solution after decades of ethnic conflict. But in spite of the cautious optimism, the Burmese army was now totally in control under the new constitution. And I wrote at the time, the 30-year story was one of the Tatmadaw never wavering from Ne Win's goal of total victory and total control over the ethnic nationalities. There remains serious doubts about the sincerity of the government of Myanmar to engage in genuine political dialogue with the ethnic nationalities. Sadly, I fear little has changed, but I will, as I did nearly 5 years ago, hand over at this point to Sally to carry on the story.
Thank you, Jack, for the presentation. Please, Sally, if you can take the microphone.
Thank you very much to Jack, and also thank you to the FCCT for inviting me here to be on the panel. I'm very glad that Jack has presented the history of the border. At least I can leave that be and move on to where we are today. And we are still floating. We haven't drowned, and so things are going, we hope, in the right direction. What I want to do is just briefly talk about the current situation that we have here on the border now and look at the prospects for return of refugees and some of the challenges that brings for both in Southeast Myanmar and here in Thailand. So as Jack noted, when he left in 2013, there were about 125,000 refugees on the border. Over the years, we've had over 250,000 refugees have passed through the camps, of which over 100,000 have gone on to third country resettlement. At its peak, there were about 150,000 in the camps here in Thailand. And today, we still have just around 98,000 refugees in the camps. If we look at what's happened since 2010 with the transition to a nominally civilian government, 2012 we had the bilateral ceasefire agreements, 2015 we had the signing of the nationwide ceasefire agreement, although only by very few of the ethnic armed groups, and then we have moved into the elections with the NLD-led government. The triggers, what we thought would be the triggers for return, have come and gone, and yet still in the camps today we have a significant population remaining. Over the years, in the last 4 years, we've seen about 14,000 people who have gone back to Burma, but that's been unassisted, and they're people who have made their own ways through their own decisions. By and large, what we thought would be a momentum that would build towards return after the bilateral ceasefires in 2012 hasn't materialized. And if we look at all the external factors, and if we look at the messages that refugees are seeing, hearing, receiving, it really is, at this point, the government of Myanmar is not ready for a large-scale return of refugees. The ethnic armed groups are not ready for large-scale return. They all are still very much involved at a much higher level of political negotiations. The peace process, which is going, we have to say at the moment, appears to be stalling. And here in Thailand, the government, the Thai government, is essentially waiting for the Myanmar government to say they are ready for return. So at present, the momentum isn't building. The external factors are not there to encourage return of refugees. And here in Thailand, at present, from the Thai government, we are not seeing pressure on the camps to return. So in this interim period, what's been happening in the camps is that people have been preparing for a future return. They have been going back to the southeast, looking at the situation in the areas where they're from. They've been making go-and-see visits with groups, meeting with local authorities, both the ethnic armed organizations and local Myanmar authorities. They've had some joint activities together with some community organizations, with civil society organizations in the southeast. So there's a dialogue, but it's not yet building towards any significant momentum towards return. But then if we look at the situation in the camps, what we're also seeing is the refugees are seeing NGOs withdrawing, they're seeing services reducing in the camps, and they feel they're being squeezed, and that this is creating anxiety. And I guess we have to say, although under the current situation, the refugees are well aware, with funding decreasing, NGOs withdrawing, services declining, the camps are not sustainable for the long term. And so for the communities, they feel that they're being pressured to return, although externally there's nothing from within Myanmar that is saying, come back, you're welcome back. And similarly, from Thailand at the moment, from the authorities' perspective, they are, we have to say at this time, being relatively patient, and they're saying they are willing, they will wait until the situation is right for refugee return. So in the camps, the message has basically been with the decrease in services, it's all about doing more with less. Over 30 years, refugees have developed an enormous range of coping strategies. For the Border Consortium, we're responsible for supporting food assistance in the camps, and we haven't had any reductions since 2015, and in fact, 80% of the population, they are managing to fill the gap where those cuts and reductions have been. But it's hard, and it's getting harder with every day. We're looking at different ways of bringing assistance to the camps that prepares people better for a life outside. We've gone from providing in-kind food assistance to piloting e-cards so that people can actually buy their food from vendors in the camps, and it gives them more choice. It gives them more of a realistic environment when in fact they are confined to camp. It is an artificial environment. The policy is they're not allowed to work outside, and so there is a limit to how much they can support themselves and their families in this environment in Thailand. They are, by and large, essentially reliant on the international community for humanitarian assistance. But within the confines of that environment, we see refugees over 30 years have developed an enormous range of coping strategies and ways of supporting their families. But what you do also see is, after 30 years living in a confined setting, you see very similar problems that you would expect in any urban environment where it's high density population, high unemployment. It's inevitable. We see increase in family conflict, gender-based violence, increase in substance abuse, and all of this creates more anxiety and stress in the refugee populations. So why aren't they going back if that's the situation in the camps? Well, when they look in the southeast of Myanmar, yes, there's been a ceasefire for bilateral ceasefires in the southeast since 2012, but they see ongoing skirmishes in the border areas. There's ongoing militarization in the southeast, in spite of there's been demands by the KNU after they signed the nationwide ceasefire agreement for withdrawal of troops, withdrawal of outposts in areas of potential return, but there has not been any withdrawal of troops. On the contrary, what communities are seeing is an increasing presence of the military. And these are communities that have spent their life fleeing from the military, fleeing from authorities. And it's not enough to have a signatory to an agreement at a high level. People want to see practical change on the ground. People's mistrust of government, of authorities, and particularly of the army, runs very deep. So while we see these, what we consider to be milestones in terms of ceasefire agreements, a ceasefire agreement is not peace. There is still a long way to go. There are no political settlements. There's no peace agreement in place. So the refugees' first question when they're asked about why don't you want to go back? Who will guarantee my security? Who can guarantee my safety? And who can? Who will take responsibility at a time when when we're still in an interim period? There is no, at present, there are no sustainable long-term agreements in place. We are very much in an interim period. And the other question is, well, but where do people want to go? Where will they go? And if we look at the camp populations today, you're looking at half the population are under 19. 30% of the population were born in Thailand. So for many of the community, where do they identify as home? For some of them, they've never lived in Burma. So when it comes to even discussing about their future, they talk about return. It's return to what? In the camps, they live in we have to say, a peri-urban setting. They have access to healthcare, education, access to markets. They've had exposure to technology, to IT. Most of these communities are from rural subsistence agricultural areas. Well, if you're a 19-year-old, you've never been a farmer in your life. Are you going to want to go back to these remote areas? So this is another aspect in the community. How do you prepare youth for a future where we don't really know where they're going to go? What we have seen is, of the 14,000 who have returned, they have largely been what we call spontaneous returns. They've individually made a decision to go back, and they've gone back unannounced and without assistance. UNHCR has a process of facilitated return, whereby this is the formal procedure, whereby people who want to go back through the formal process, they're interviewed by the government of Myanmar, and through that process then it takes them one step on to getting recognition as citizens in Myanmar, and but first they have to be screened by the government and approved before they can return back to the country. To date, we've only seen 70 people out of that 14,000. Only 70 people have actually gone through that process and gone back to Myanmar, and that was about a year ago, in a very highly publicized, high-profile return, which actually acted as a deterrent to other refugees, they were very concerned at the publicity this gave. These are people who fled from authorities, and suddenly here are returnees, their photographs are in the papers, their details of their families, where they're going to live. For most of these refugees, when they think about return, they want to go as far away from the authorities as they can. They're looking to disappear into their communities. But also they're concerned that if they raise their profile now with the authorities, what happens if the peace process collapses? What happens if it turns the other way and they've exposed themselves to the authorities? So there is not, at the moment, there isn't that drive, that momentum for people to come forward for this official procedure for return. There's another 250 individuals waiting. They've been screened by the government of Myanmar, but they're still waiting for approval to be able to return to their country. And some of them have been waiting for almost a year. So again, it's a very slow process. The official procedures are slow, they're complex, but they raise the profile of refugees. So that is a concern, and yet what we have to bear in mind is refugees. So what are the options for refugees? Here in Thailand, they have no status. They're essentially illegal migrants whose whose deportation has been temporarily suspended. So they have, as individuals, they're in a limbo. They have no status. If they go back to Myanmar through the official process, there's a possibility that they will get into a system to get documentation and citizenship. And also in Myanmar, we understand that there has been a process whereby in the last about 4 years, around 500,000 people from remote communities have been able to access citizenship in the country. But for the refugees in the camps, for many of them, they're perhaps thinking, we've seen many of them, for them their option is, well, there's no work in Myanmar. They see every day, we see people coming across the border from Myawaddy into Mae Sot. It's estimated still about 80% of households in the southeast have somebody working in Thailand to support the family back in Myanmar. So the message to the refugees is, well, there aren't the jobs back there in Myanmar. Maybe there are more opportunities here in Thailand. But in that case, that's when ID and legal status becomes more important, really. It is that these refugees, if they just merge into the migrant communities, they will remain as stateless people. They will become illegal people in Thailand. And so therefore, I think one of the challenges is really to expedite how to give people more options. It's really crucial that we address issues around documentation and identity. So I think what I really want to just end with at this point is for us, the challenges that we have are with the camps as we see funding services decreasing. Our challenge is really to ensure that we can ensure access to essential services while we're in an environment of declining resources. I think also we need to look at how we can expedite legal processes to enable documentation for refugees who are currently in limbo in the camps. And what we also need to be looking at is in the southeast, what is needed so for those people who want to return, for those people who are willing to take the risks, even though it's not the time for a large-scale return, how can we scale up some of the small-scale programs that are happening in southeast Myanmar such that refugees who've been used to healthcare, access to education, the markets, when they go back to Myanmar, will also be able to have access to some similar level of services. But I'm sure that Dr. Cynthia will be able to talk more about services and the ethnic service providers in these areas in some of her talks. So at this point I will end it there, but just to say what we're hoping for in the long term, our hope for return is it will be a gradual process. What we would like to see is something that it's incremental, it's a voluntary return, because that will be, it can be more sustainable if it happens over a slow period of time. What we hope will not happen is that the situation in the camps is such that refugees feel squeezed to the point where they have no options but to leave and go back to their country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And now we'll proceed with Dr. Cynthia.
Good evening, everybody. Today, I would like to highlight the role of the health workers and the civil society groups who are building the community during the conflicts and during the interim period. So as our colleagues already mentioned, we have very long border between Thailand and Myanmar. So there are almost 2,000 kilometers, and both sides of the border we have different ethnicity and diverse culture. And as you may already aware, like conflicts, human rights violation, economic exploitation, and the environmental deterioration make more and more people crossing the border from Thailand to Burma to Thailand for getting better job opportunity and also healthcare access. So in terms of the population, until now, there are still almost 500,000 people displaced who cannot return home. And some of those still become internally displaced people because the land, they used to displace from their homeland, but the land already confiscated or grabbed by the business or army, so they can stay going back home, and about 100,000 in the refugee camps. And also almost 300,000 migrant workers who are living, working in Thailand. And there are many state political exile group and the human rights group working and supporting the services in Thailand side. So I would like to start with Maeto Clinic because I'm also working with Maeto Clinic since the Maeto Clinic started in 1989. In 1988, when the Burmese military cracked down the pro-democracy movement, there are thousands of students and civilians who fled to the border. So after a long journey, there are many camps being established on the border. And between 1988 and 1994 initial stage, the clinic being set up not as a clinic or hospital, as a referral coordination center or emergency relief center, because the thousands of students who fled to the border need medical assistance and they need humanitarian assistance like food. So we start mobilize the resources coming from our Thai partner organization or partner or community and the local current organization. So we're able to set up the emergency relief and the medical services. And at that time, most of the beneficiaries are the students who fled to the border. But the students who fled to the border, they don't see themselves as a refugee. And they are very active, they play very active role in building their community. So the clinic being set up by the student and the doctor nurses who fled to the border during that time. And many students also, while they fled to the border, they brought the books and then start setting up the library in different camp locations. And many teachers also start seeing that there are young people who fled to the border. They need to continue education. So the school be set up, and every night you can see in the camp people are teaching, helping each other. They are not seeing themselves as a victim. They prepare for their future, and they also try to establish the community organization. So in the beginning, most of the services or the cases we see are war casualty, because at that time there is a huge fighting going on, and this is a malaria infected area. The eastern Burma is highly infected by malaria, so most of our cases are malaria, war casualty. And many students who fled to the border also, they never been to the jungle, and there are always some issue about shortage of food, and then also they have witnessed some displacement in the war zone, and then they also missing their family, so we can see a lot of like trauma, and we have to help to each other for mental health counseling program. Even we don't have the specialized mental health skill, but the community themselves helping each other. So you may see initially the clinic being setting up with very limited resources, and we don't have any instruments, or we don't have good sterilization equipment, so we have to start setting up with minimal resources spotted by local Thai community initially. In 1989, the clinic being developed as a teaching center or training center. We also have some international volunteer and doctor nurses coming from overseas start helping us to establish a clinic. And many students who are in the jungle also, they start learning public health, they become the community health volunteer. So they have seen that there are many villages being displaced, and many women, children need to access healthcare service. So they start reach out to the community, start setting up mobile medical team, and then through that way the community being mobilized to engage in their protecting their own health. And we also see that the Burmese student and the civilian who fled to the border, this is the first experience for them while they are in the city. They heard about like a black zone insurgent, but while they are start arriving to the jungle, they see the witness and what is going on the border, like forced labor, forced relocation, and then the people who been displaced from the war, like women, mostly are women and children. So what is the black zone mean? Like sometimes it's like insurgent group or people who are violent, but actually what the student and the civilian who fled to the border witness is this is the first time they can give this information to the world, because it has been isolated for many years. So the women, children who displaced from the war have been suffer like malnutrition, and also women occur without accessing the antenatal care, family planning. So many women also die in the jungles. That's why the student or become like a more social activist, try to improve access to healthcare services and social service. So in 1997, one of the refugee camps was burned down. At that time, many students also, many children start drawing the picture, because when the camp was burned down, we try to help or assist the children who their school is interrupted, and then also many children being traumatized. But when they were encouraged to start drawing the picture, because it's part of the like healing, and also we want to make sure that, because when we say about the counseling, mostly the elder people or the adult can get support, but for the children, sometimes nobody address the child psychosocial issue at that time. So with the support from some international organization, we want to start child psychosocial problem, but we need to learn that how the children's psychosocial issues. So these are the children drawing while they flee to Thailand, how they have to cross the border from Moei River to Thailand. And at the same time, some children also drawing the picture when they flee from the fighting, and also the village being burnt. So these all photos being drawn by the refugee children in 1997 when the camp being attacked. So between 1995 and 1998, the clinic, Maeto clinic we set up in the Thailand side become more obvious, because we have seen that many women who deliver in the jungle without accessing to the emergency obstetric or safe delivery service. So we start train community midwife, and we start identify the risk women, and we bring them to Thailand for emergency obstetric referral, because at that time these women also living in the jungle and they never access to emergency obstetric care. So we brought the women to Thailand and start working with the Thai government, especially Mae Sot Hospital. They start help us to build the maternal child health center, vaccination program, family planning clinic, and we train more and more community midwife to improve access to the safe delivery service. And these are the women who usually deliver baby in the jungle. So we have to help them to train how to use the gloves and how to do safe birthing practice. And then gradually the women themselves also, they very happy to learn about, because they can learn more, they can help more people in their community. So between 2000 and 2010, in this period, we have seen that there is increasing number of migrant workers in Thailand. So we start addressing the issue for the child protection education, because many children start deliver baby in Thailand, and many of them they deliver at home. So we see that we need to improve access to the deliver in the health facility. But since many women are not documented, or they don't have financial support, they deliver at home. So we try to improve our maternity clinic, and we try to set up the emergency obstetric facility in our own facility. And then we expanding and upgrading the services needed for the landmine victims, because at that time we see that many landmine victims could not access the prosthetic or rehabilitation center. So during that period, we started improve service for maternal child health rehabilitation. And then after gradually we seen that more migrant workers, and we start documenting that how many people coming from accessing service from inside or here, not only the migrant workers, and many villagers from Karen state, they're crossing the border from Burma to Thailand to access services. So currently almost 50% of our patients are also coming from Burma. So this drug, we want to highlight the children who were born in Thailand. So at the clinic, we see that there are about 2,000, 2,500 deliveries annually. So until 2008, there has been no system for children who were born outside the health facility, Thai health facility, could not access the birth register, official birth certificate. And the women who don't have legal documents also very difficult to access birth registration. So in 2008, the Thai policy approved that regardless of the parent status, or regardless whether you were born, the children were born at home or in the health facility, can access birth registration. So as you may see that we try to support all the baby who were born at Maeto clinic can access birth registration. So until now, the women start knowing the benefit of accessing the birth registration when they were born, whether they were born in Thailand or Burma. But the challenge just is even they get the birth certificate from Thailand, this doesn't mean they are Thai or Burmese citizen, because in the document, this show the undocumented migrant worker, it doesn't mention their nationality, because many women also doesn't have legal documents, or even they don't have Burmese nationality. So the children are still stateless, but they have a certificate called certificate of identity. So the benefit is they can travel with the parents. Before, the children cannot travel with the parents because they not belong to each other. But now we try to improve access to the birth register, and then try to advocate for the children who were born in Thailand to get citizenship in Burma side. So these are some of the photos, like during 2004 or 2010, 2015, there's a very busy clinic. And every day we have 200, 300 patients coming from both sides of the border. And we try to establish or upgrading our maternal and child health facility. And today, Maeto Clinic, we have almost 300 health workers, including midwife, laboratory technician, public health worker. And in 2016, our clients and the number of clients who access to us is almost 55,000, and almost 48% coming from Burma. And the women of reproductive age and children accounts for almost 50% of our clients. And we also support school health program, because many migrant schools been setting up in Tak province, so they cannot access to the Thai education system because since they are mobile population. So in the migrant learning center to access health services and vaccination, we work with the Thai public health, so to improve access to vaccination, school health, water sanitation in the school. And the clinic being the clinic's been setting up in the very like a substandard. The facility is very low facility, and then we in 2010 we able to start purchase land with the support from our Thai community, and then we able to relocate our new clinic in 2016. And we have now currently we have 140 beds, and our bed occupancy rate is still high, almost 75%. So currently we have a partnership in Thailand side. We have a partnership with the Thai Foundation, Ministry of Health, and Thai University. So the Thai Foundation was set up in 2010 to support the organization, the civil society organization, Burmese civil society organization, who could not be registered in Thailand. But for the legal protection and for the strategic planning, to work with the Thai government, we set up a foundation to protect the civil society group, and we work with the Thai government services for communicable disease, cross-border collaboration, immunization coverage in the community. And we work with university in Thailand, like Konkan University and Thammasat University, because many refugees, health worker, and the ethnic health worker, even we were trained by different NGOs and different civil society group. The education certificate is not recognized by both Thailand and Burmese government. So when the health worker return home, they need to be recognized as health worker. They need to continue provide service in their own community, not just going back to Burma as a refugee, another like this return home as an ordinary person, because the reason they join or work with the health organization is they were motivated by many health organization and health program, and they want to continue rebuild their own community. So since 2002, we work with university to get some accreditation, but we still need to continue work with the Burmese government or inside Burma to accept or to recognize the existing ethnic health infrastructure. So in 2014, with the collaboration with different ethnic health organization and Maeto Clinic and other civil society group, we have a health system strengthening project which made a standard of care in all the ethnic health center. So currently the ethnic health clinic being continue provide primary healthcare service delivery and improving the standard of care. And then we try to address the human resource shortage in the Eastern Burma and also in Thailand, because both Thailand and Burma seeing, especially on the border, seeing the human resource shortage because the mobile population, migrant population is not documented or not counted. So that means access to the both Thailand and Burmese government system could not cope with all these population which are not accounted for. So we work with different community organizations to continue train community midwife and to continue train the public health worker to try to address the human resource shortage issue and try to advocate with the government for decentralized health system, because the health system in Burma is still highly centralized. There has been no local, like a state level authority, but most of the state level government or health minister are like just coordination role. Most of the policy level and administration directly come from the central part, so we try to advocate for the decentralization. And we also continue to do consultation with different community, because the community being affected by war and they see different group. Now we have two parallel health systems. So how to, one day we need to converge or we need to start working together. So we need to consult with the community organization, and we need to engage with the community for health convergence. And they need to take more active role in the ownership in their own healthcare system. So in 2016, when we relocate our clinic, also we have the board member from different expertise, like some are from Ministry of Health, some are from the local official, and we also have the health professional, human rights activists, lawyer are working together on improving the governance and to improve the sustainability of the clinic. So this is a new clinic in the opening ceremony. So we still see a big challenge for migrant population and vulnerable population. In 2012, since 2012, when the Burmese political change, there has been many the ceasefire talk and also try to strengthen the health system in Burma for us to converge health system from the ethnic side and Burma side. But Thailand side also, we still see a lot of migration, and child protection and women protection is still a big concern, because many of them stay undocumented migrant workers, and still many children are not registered, cannot register birth. And also we still see there are many family continue coming without like a social network. So the community themselves also have to try to reach to the new arrival. So for us, the health has a human right, so we continue trying to advocate that. Providing health services mean like try to save the life of the people, but at the same time we have to look at the broader issue, because the job security and safe working environment and the food security, human rights violation, land confiscation, environment deterioration, this continue make people become vulnerable. So for human rights protection is one of Maeto Clinic approach for promoting health services. And women, children protection, not only we are doing the service provision for the medical services, also women, children protection is the integrated in our health services. So in the future also, we will continue to provide this vulnerable population. As I mentioned earlier, they are based on the Thai government or Ministry of Interior documentation. We say there are 300 migrant workers. Many of them are like daily, every day they're crossing the border, and only less than 100,000 are documented, and many of them are undocumented, and many of them are women, children accompany them. So we also try to facilitate the cross-border referral system, because since 2014-15, our funding in Thailand side or on the border has been significantly reduced. So referring patient to Thai hospital or providing the clinical services is a huge challenge for us. That's why we also try to improve service inside Burma so that people don't need to cross the border and come to us. So that's why we work with different ethnic groups and civil society groups to improve access health service inside Burma. But the ethnic health organization and community can provide primary level service. For the secondary and tertiary level, we still need to refer to the government service. So we try to encourage them or try to facilitate to refer to the government hospital instead of referring to Thailand. Most of our clients who refer to Thai hospital are also coming across the border who require emergency obstetric care. So not only Maeto Clinic, we also have other NGO who are providing emergency obstetric care. So we have to start looking at opportunity for referring patients to the hospital in Burma, like Myaudi Hospital or Cochrane Hospital. But it is very challenging because the Burmese government hospital also have shortage of health worker and doesn't have enough equipment supply yet. So it will take some time to build up the capacity of the hospital in Burma as well. So for the primary level, we try to improve the services like health promotion activity, disease surveillance. But for the secondary level, tertiary level care, access to this service is a challenge for us. And women and children protection is still become a key area for us because we have seen that children being abused, women suffer from gender-based violence and unplanned pregnancy, unsafe abortion. All these issues are also continue facing. And many new arrivals are also adolescent group, young people. So we have to address this issue in the community as like promoting adolescent reproductive health because many of them, they separate from the community and they don't have parents in that area. So strengthening the community network to protect these young people is very important because every day we still see high incidence of HIV, TB, and also like adolescent pregnancy. So these are still continue the service that we need to continue provide. And through our health system strengthening project, we work with more than 200 clinics and we reach to 650,000 population in the eastern Burma in Karen, Karenni, Mon, and Shan state. And also we are moving to continue collaborate with the Burmese military, Burmese Ministry of Health for roll-up of National Health Plan, and the aim is also universal health coverage. That's why we try to improve access, our client try to improve access to the health insurance from the Thai government, but there are still many challenges because the documentation issue, population mobility issue. So our recommendation for both Thailand government, both Thailand and Burmese government is we need to provide safe working environment and to ensure that appropriate documentation and free of exploitation for the migrant and their family members, and the continue provide services and strengthening services for the children and women. And then when we rebuild the community, not only the physical support, also as I mentioned earlier, like women, children suffering a lot from the trauma during the war. And until now, there is little attention paid for the mental health problem. So when we say about the national reconciliation or community rebuilding, mental health and social counseling, mental and social counseling is one of the area why we continue building the trust and building the peace. So the health worker, the role of the health worker is not only providing the clinical services, and the counseling and community rebuilding is one of the crucial part of the healthcare work on the border. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cynthia. Please, Shamdong.
Good evening, everyone. So I will take you along to the Shan border in northern Thailand. And today I would like to share the situation of the Shan refugees. So basically in northern part, border with Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai, and Mae Sot province. And the Shan, the situation is different because there's no refugee camp for the Shan, even though they face the same persecution from the Burma military. So I will go through some of these stories in the past 21 years, that the situation until current situation. The big massive forced relocation and the big migration and forced movement of the Shan to Thailand is taking place in 1996, between 96 to 98. During that time, it was under the scorched earth campaign by the Burma military to wipe out the new armed group that do not surrender to the Burma army after the Muang Thai army led by Khun Sa at that time. And during that time, villagers were forced to leave, to flee their home within 3 or 7 days. And most of them do not get anything with them. So they were forced to go to live in town or in the main roads in Shan State. And a lot of them went into hiding as internally displaced people. And during that years, over 1,400 villagers were forced to relocate. So when we look at the Rakhine State today, the villagers, and you can see in eastern border, and this is the Shan villagers. During that time, they were just forced to relocated, and massive forced human rights like abuses, torture, rape, and kill took place during this time. This is the massacre of 56 villagers in Kun Hing Township in central Shan State during that time. So they were allowed to go back to their farm to get some livestock, to get some food from the Burma military, and they have the pass that they can go back in their old village. But on their way back, they were all massacred, killed by two incidents in Kun Hing Township near the Bang River. And that was in 1997. Most of the Shans are Buddhist, if you look at the atrocities. So during that time, over 1,000 Buddhist temples were left derelict, and many of them were just left behind like this, destroyed. And Burma military stationed in all these temples during their operation. They cut down the Buddha's image and the head of the Buddha image and left all the old script, which is very valuable for the community, tradition, and culture. But this is what they did to the communities. During that time, a lot of abbots and monks were killed. They were tortured, like drowned in the river, all kinds of arrested and tortured them, and hit them with the nail on top of the monk's head and then throw them in the river. So there are lots of documents of monks and abbots who they suspected that they support the Shan resistance during that time. So this is what happened to the Buddhist communities in Shan State by the same military, the Burma military today. During the forced relocation time, the Shan Human Rights Foundation and the Shan Women's Action Network documented incidents of widespread rape and sexual violence committed by the Burma military from over 40 battalions who were operating during that time. And the License to Rape report documented how rape is officially used as a weapon of war in order to terrorize, demoralize, and control the local communities, because rape is considered as very shameful action when it takes place to the people in the communities. And we documented over 173 cases, and over 80% of them are committed by high-ranking officers, and most of the time in front of their troops. The same battalions also committed the same rape and violence in different places, and it's very terrible because most of the rape also result in death. So over 25%, like mother and daughter was raped at the same time when the troops came in. and gang rape is over 60%. And out of these, and it's very brutal. Like for example, when the women die after being raped or gang raped, the people saw like dry cell battery in her sexual organ or cut the breast, you know. So it's very, very horrible situation during that time against women in the relocation site. And out of these over 173 cases, only one perpetrator was punished, and which was just send him to another base. So that was the punishment at the time that we documented. Another major reason of why the Shan refugees are forced to flee to the, from Shan state to Thailand is that between 1999 to 2001, it was during General Kim Yoon time, and he made a deal with the United War State Army under the drug eradication program. They have forced resettle like over 120,000 Wa from northern, so in near the China border in Bang Sang area, to southern border of Taki Lek, Meung Ton, and also Mae Sot township near the Thailand border. So this is a big population, and when they come, they also started to take the land and crops, and even like started to arrest the headman or head villager and force the villagers to leave their land. So the local Akha, Lahu, and Shan who live in this area, who are originally live in these townships, were forced, you know, to leave their home. So this is another major influx of the Shan refugees during that time. This map just shows you, even though there's no official refugee camp, but even though like the people face all these massive forced relocation and all kinds of persecutions against them, when they come to Thailand, it's not allowed. They are not allowed to set up the camp or refugee camp in Thailand. So many times they are pushed back by Thai government. So now on the other side of the border, there are 5 main camps. So from Mae Son border to Loi Kaw Wan, so 5 in Chiang Rai. We have one exception case with an exception of the only refugee camp of Shan refugee in northern Chiang Mai province with only about 400 populations. Because they are not recognized as refugees, when they fled to Thailand, what happened is that they have no protection and the food, basic support to help them when they first arrive. So they are the most vulnerable group in order to continue their survival. So they have no status and any types of kind of documentation, and therefore have very little access to other facilities and programs, you know, that is very basic, like food, education, health, during this crisis. And if we look at the refugee camp, as Jack and Sally have mentioned, that is on the western border, there's this, the refugee camps for Karen and Kareni, and other in the northern part, there's no camp for the Shan, so with an exception of one which is still unofficial and not recognized and or get any kinds of documentation by the UNCHR. So what happened to most of the Shan? So even hundreds of thousands of them fled. So they become migrant workers to survive every day, you know, day to day. So these are the 3 generations of people who fled from during that time. And you can see the grandparents, you know, they all come, maybe only 1 or 2 people work, you know, to feed the whole family. So they will find job, any kinds of job, so any work, you know, for their survival and a place that they can live. So the small room on the hut is for one whole family. So that is for at least 2 families, the whole family in the farm. And this kind of farm in northern Chiang Mai is mainly, especially from orange plantation. And some farm, there are hundreds of them. In one of the farm, at least we know that one farm, there are about 2,000 Shan refugees who work, you know, in that farm, and they are living in a very difficult condition because of the low payment, as well as they use a lot of pesticides, you know, so some of the chemicals are very strong. You can spray in 3 seconds, and the worm will die immediately in front of you, and there's no protection or support for the workers or the refugees who work, to support this kind of farm. And a lot of children, some farms there are about 200 children. So what we do is the community response to provide education and also like mobile education center for these children, as they don't have any kinds of documentation and therefore cannot access to other services like education and health and other. Most of the Shan IDP camps located in a hilltop of the mountains, which is very different than the traditional living of the Shans, because most Shan live in the valley where they can farm, and there's enough water to be like sufficient farmers. So when they fled to the Thai Burma border, and in this one, so this is one of the camps. So it's very high on the mountains. The water is very difficult. You walk 1 hour and then walk 1 hour up. So like about 2 hours per day. And children have to walk very far, the same, the whole, with the whole people in the camp. And there's no, the soil is not good to grow the plants that will be sustainable for them as before. And this is Loiko One camp, which is in border with in Chiang Rai province. They came from like the village on the other side, and they set up the camp just like this. This Kong Mung Mung, an IDP camp opposite Mae Sot province. And this is like 5 hours from the Thai border of the Chiang Mai, so called Loi Lam IDP camp. This IDP camp was, in the past, they were already in Shan side. And in 2005, the Thai military said, even though this camp is on Shan side, but from Thailand we can see it very clear, so therefore the camp should move further. So they forced the houses and the refugees to live under the side of the mountains, so that people cannot see from Thailand. So this is by the Third Army, like the Thai army. So they have to live in a difficult condition, and there's no protection for them. And this is the current numbers of the total IDPs and refugees along the northern border, along with Thailand. So 5 IDP camps and 1 refugee camp, about 6,200 people. 40% of them are children, and in combined, 70% of them are women and children. There's a big security challenge for the IDPs, for the IDP camp. So the IDP camp is in the blue star, the blue color. They are just next about 50 meters or 100 meters near the Burma military bases. So the red one are the Burma military bases, and the yellow one is the United States Army bases. So from the camp, they can see their homes, right? Where they come from, where it has already been confiscated or taken by the United States Army and the Burma military. So there's no security or safety, for these IDPs at all. And fighting took place on this border in northern Thailand. And this is in 2005 when the UWSA and the Burma military attacked and shelled over 2,000 shells per day, just near the IDP camps. And the children have to go hide in the bunkers, and these are the situation of the IDPs in this area. Because there's no recognition and there's no official refugee camp, so the communities have started the services themselves, and as a basic support and a basic healthcare and education. But however, it's the primary healthcare, and for any serious illness, it has to be transferred to the Thai hospital, which means they have to get permission from the Thai authority at the checkpoint, right, at the Thai military checkpoint before they can cross into Thai side to be referred or treated at the Thai hospital. And we have cases of where women die or children die just during the pregnancy, and this kind of cases happen. For education, each camp started the education program and the basic education. However, it's still with the existing support. However, the need is still about the challenge on the teacher's salary or teacher training to upgrade, as well as the nutrition for the children in the camp. These are the total numbers of the children in 5 camps, so over 1,000 children in the school. I would like to talk about the only one camp in Thailand. It's called UNCHR. It is about 3 hours from Chiang Mai town, right in the northern border. And it was set up in 2002 after the fierce fighting between the Burma military and the Shan State Army. And the shells fall into Thai side. And at that time, villagers fled from 4 villages in Shan State to Thailand. And a lot of horrible abuses took place, like 12-year-old boy was killed, 1 man was chopped in 3 parts. So all villagers were very afraid, and they all fled to Thailand. And so now until today, the villagers have been. I just want to show you. So this is the camp, and this is the border, and their hometowns are from these 4 villages. Now it's all taken by the Burma military and the UWSA, because the Burma army allowed them to take this land. So therefore, it's very fearful that the villagers who are currently living in this only one refugee camp in Thailand to go back into this area. And during the ceasefire talk, the Restoration Council of Shan State, or the RCSS and the Shan State Army, they had talked with during the peace talk. One of the agreement was they would be able to go and have control of Meung Tha, which is in this area. But until today, only a few members of RCSS could go in this area, and they were not allowed by the Burma military and the UWSA to go in further with even the more members. So how can the villagers who fled from all these abuses, feel safe that they can go back to their home? So from the camp, they can see their old village, and from the Thai side, but they can just look at that, but they are not welcome to go back. I will just go quickly to reasons why the refugees cannot return yet. Number 1 is because of the increased militarization in Shan State. There are total 14 regional commands in Burma right now, and the newest one is in Shan State, the 14th one. It was built after 2010 election, and there are 4 regional commands out of 14 in Burma. And after the massive force relocation in 1996, this one, the Central Eastern Regional Command in Koh Lam, was set up after the 2010 election. So it is absolutely more increase and more control in different parts of Shan State. Before, there were only Tang Chi, La Seo, Northern Regional Command, and East Triangle Command in Keng Tung, but now they have a Koh Lam base, which is very right in the center of Shan State. And this regional command have at least estimate about 35 more new battalions alone with this new increase, with Air Force and other that is based here. So the war and most of the conflict and commands are taking place very close from this regional command now. So you can imagine 1/4 of the total Burma military are currently based in Shan State, and it means very strategic for Burma military to increase the militarization in this area. I would like to give one example. After the forced relocation, this is in Meung Nai Township in southern Shan State. Before the massive forced relocation in 1996, there were over 200 villages, but now only 83 villages left, and over 140 villages disappear from the map of Burma and in Shan State. And which means that where can the refugees or migrants, go back to their original home from Shan State? And how can they go back and say to get their identification card or say that they are people from this area? And this is very serious issue for the migrants and also the refugees, the Shan refugees. I also want to point out that these 83 villages, about over 20 of them are new villages, quote unquote, and most of them are the people from Central Burma that moved into the area, And in one of the area, the Shan become the minority in this area while during the forced relocation, and now they go back and they are just told by Burma military of what they should be doing. So this is very fearful, and this is one of the reasons why the refugees cannot return. The other reason is the threat of the big mega development projects such as the large dams and other coal minings and all kinds of mining. And these dams on the Salween, one of the dams where the IDPs and refugees come from, the refugees come from is in Central Shan State, so which will flood up to the whole Central Shan State. And it will produce 7,000 megawatts of electricity, mainly to sell to Thailand and China. And a lot of the refugees cannot return. And if such project is built, there's no way that the refugees can go back, and there's no home for them to return. There has been the bilateral ceasefire agreement as well as the nationwide ceasefire agreement and the NCA in 2015. However, the fighting still continues, and not only in the area where there's no NCA signatory, but even though they signed a nationwide ceasefire agreement, the Burma military still attacked, and the fighting took place. Even 2 weeks ago, there were over 600 refugees, IDPs fled their home, and the attacks still continue even though they signed a nationwide ceasefire. So there's no trust and there's no peace on the ground, from, especially for the people. And you can see the fighting is escalating in northern Shan State and Kachin State and other parts. And the fight, and the fighting and offensive and the attacks, for example, in the Gogang area, and in different parts of northern Shan State are taking place. And we also documented further fighting in the southern and also central Shan State with the NCA signatory groups, and all kinds of human rights abuses took place. These IDPs and refugees, even though because of their situation, they have depended on aid, international aid, all these years, and they cannot return home. And as you may know, that starting from October 1st, all the Shan border, all the the IDP camps, and one only refugee camp with about 400 people, the food aid, there had been decrease of the basic food aid. And starting from this month, October 1st, there has been totally cut off of all the aid that they used to have, the basic aid that they have, because of the funding decrease from donors. So this month, starting from this month, there's no rice, that's what they get. So over these 6,000 people just without food aid. So the situation is desperate and it is in crisis. While the peace process is stuck and it's not going anywhere, and the fighting continues, there's no guarantee for safety and the peace process, and there's no political dialogue. And at the same time, the food aid and the only thing they can depend on now is being cut off. So this is a crisis for all the Shan borders, and therefore the communities, the refugees community gather in August, and they want to raise their voices and calling for help from the international communities to continue to support them, to make them survive, and also to make them recognize and with the dignity of refugees. 21 years, there's no legal redress or justice for these people. They were persecuted. They come to Thailand with no recognition of basic support, and now they are the first group to go under the new peace process of Burma, or seeing something that is still very unsure for the refugees. So I'm showing this picture. It's the activities from different Shan IDP camps, urging the international communities and donors to continue to support them until they can return home. They wanted to go home, but there's no safe place to return, and they want to go back to their own home, but there's no peace yet for them to return and live with dignity and with as human beings. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Shantung, for the presentation. The floor is now open for question. Microphone is over there. And please state your name and affiliation, if any.
Peter Jansen, Asia Times. Maybe I address this question to Jack. You know, number one, thank you very much for reminding us all of the offensive against the Karens in the Karen state, Manipulaw, and all these things. I was here and reporting on that it was such a long time ago. It's good for you to refresh everybody's memories, especially during these times when everybody's concentrating on the Rakhine and the Rohingya, yeah? And, you know, my question is, why, your opinion, why the Rakhine has captured world attention to such an extent, whereas the offensive against the Karen, you know, even though we were reporting on it, was not big news. It certainly wasn't front page news, yeah? I could ask the same question to our Shan friend, you know, is there some annoyance, disappointment that these Burmese military attacks on the Shan and the Karen, very similar in their nature to the attack on the Rohingya, so-called Rohingya in the Rakhine. Why, you know, why were they basically totally ignored by the world, certainly by the media to some extent, and have had such little impact? Yeah?
Yeah, thank you. I think you partly answered the question yourself. The Manipulaw fell back in 1995, more than 20 years ago. Technology, availability of news, etc., was totally different in those days. The Burmese border was very remote in those days. What has really impressed me or surprised me with the current exodus of the Rohingya has been the amazing footage that's been available on TV. But modern technology now with drones and all of that means that it is easier. But the other factor is surely the scale. 250,000, I mentioned just briefly in one slide, 250,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh back in 1992. I don't remember that receiving any kind of international coverage. But on our border, there was never any really massive movement of people. We grew from 10,000 refugees in 1984 to 150,000 refugees 25 years later. And I don't think in a single year we have more than about 10,000 refugees cross the border. So in some ways it was not also really not such a very big story that this massive exodus of the Rohingya to Bangladesh.
In my opinion, I think there's some, we can say that there has been silence and different kinds of engagement from the international communities or different governments to Burma now. And we have seen during the past, after the 2010 election, there's been very little statement of concern or condemnation on the Burma military attacks, on the ethnic conflict and things like that. So I think it's, and also very little like statement coming out, I think, from the international communities. And that must also link to their engagement and policy with Burma that may not have that much attention on the human rights situation, especially the conflict, you know, while they wanted to wait and show a big support, you know, for the peace process in Burma. But there has been little pressure on the Burma military, you know, to engage, really involve or really have a real political dialogue with the ethnic groups in Burma. That's, I think it's very much on their policy to engage this issue on the human rights abuses.
Any other question?
I'm Andy Silver, a member of FCCT. My question is, what determines the policies of the INGOs in giving aid? I understand that after 2011, much of the cross-border aid ceased, and the INGOs wanted to promote peace, in quotation marks, by having the aid go through Naypyidaw or Yangon. And I think, has this created problems for running your programs along the border and in Karen State and Shan State?
I'm not going to speak for all the INGOs on this, but in terms of, inevitably, for many of the NGOs, their policies are donor-driven, depending where they can access funds. But I think also, in terms of cross-border assistance, there is still, NGOs do raise funds through their own means, not through government funding, where they're not bound by government policies as to where funding can and cannot be allocated. But I guess if you're looking at a large-scale response, then you are essentially drawing on government funds, which then does limit where you can and cannot use that money. I think at the moment in Myanmar, there is an issue in the southeast, because the southeast is seen not as a conflict area, not in need of humanitarian assistance. The southeast is seen as early recovery. And so therefore, for Myanmar, humanitarian funds are only available for Kachin, Northern Shan, and Rakhine State. And in the southeast, communities now are expected to look at development funds. And there's a gap. There's a gap between the days when humanitarian assistance runs out. You don't suddenly overnight become self-reliant and working on a sustainable future. So it's how do you address that gap? It's going to be an issue for refugees when they return. How do they get some initial support to assist with return, but you can't become self-reliant in 3 months. So this is something that we need to look at further with the donor community as well, on how you can access funds for these marginal groups.
Jim Pollard from Asia Times. Just a question to Sally, if I may. Jack, when he was, just before he left, I think he was having to raise $35 million. I just wonder what the figure is now. How much money are you trying to get? And are you also having to do international lobbying efforts the way Jack did, going to Washington and that to get your funds? And are you also finding in your dealings with the EU or the US or other donor countries that they, I remember at one point, maybe 5 years ago, the EU, led by countries such as Germany, was saying they wanted to get their funds off the border into the front door, into Yangon. That obviously has happened. But the other thing that's happened in the meanwhile is the refugee crisis created by the Syrian war. Do they talk to you about that? Is that another reason that's been given to you for why the more funds aren't forthcoming?
I mean, for sure. I mean, just in terms of, say, the scale of funding, if we look at the population at its peak, the population has now declined 30%, and funding available has decreased 50%. So we are constantly faced with sort of deficits in our budgets and always seeking for new funds. But unfortunately, refugees in Thailand are yesterday. They're yesterday's news. Donor mechanisms are not suited to 30-year protracted refugee situations. We are, in effect, competing with emerging crises, global priorities elsewhere, and one has to say, I mean, they are crises. What's been happening in Syria, when we look at Yemen, when we look at Europe, now what we look at emerged in Rakhine, these are very real emerging crises. And so it is very difficult when you're in a protracted refugee situation where you hope there's actually an end in sight to this, that you will be, that donors will stick with it and see it through, that they don't at the last minute pull out such that everything unravels, so that the time when people go back, they're actually in a worse state than they should be. At this point, you need to see it through with them to the point where they go back and they're able to reintegrate. And yes, we certainly do have donors that have come. Some have directly met with the refugees and said, we've looked at it on a global scale and we have our own indicators and we've put our numbers, and refugees in Thailand doesn't even get on the board. So sorry, we're withdrawing, we're pulling out. And so there is no more. We have a handful of donors. The US is the largest donor to the border programs at present. And there are some very key donors who have stuck with it, and we have to hope that they will stay with it. But it gets increasingly difficult to raise funds for all of the NGOs working on the border. We're having to prioritize services more and more. We're having to look much more at who are the most vulnerable within these populations. We've changed from what was same assistance for everybody to actually really focus on where are the needs the greatest within a refugee population. So it's not the same for everybody. Some get nothing, some are actually considered to be relatively self-reliant, and others are still very vulnerable. And so it's about prioritizing where those needs are. But undoubtedly, it's a shrinking environment. And with every new crisis, that's where the humanitarian funds are all competing for the same pot. I don't think it's so much for the refugees that donors have just switched their funds to Myanmar. The funding in Myanmar is different. It's around development. But I think at this point, the Southeast is still grappling with a ceasefire. It still doesn't have peace. One's still looking at how do you support that peace process. It's going to be essential to actually support communities through this time of the peace process before really people are still living in a conflict mentality. I think a lot of the ethnic armed groups, they've been defined by conflict all their life. You don't suddenly go into a ceasefire and start looking at long-term development. It's not within people's thinking, and I think it will take I think we'll have to skip a generation before one gets into longer-term strategies, because by and large there is no long-term strategy of development for the Southeast. It's all still very much responsive, reactive, and we've got to get beyond that into something that has a much more longer-term outlook. Similarly, I think for the local authorities, they've got to think longer-term than just a humanitarian response in the Southeast. I mean, elsewhere in Burma, yes, there are really very large crises, not just emerging. The Rakhine is an emerging situation. Kachin, Northern Shan has been just ongoing, and still needs, and has been ongoing and has remained largely invisible, largely because of access issues, and they're not being addressed.
Santong, yes.
If I may add, I think for the local ethnic communities, especially like with the refugees and also people living in conflict in Shan state of Burma, one of the questions I think that we have is that the growing question. So the same countries are the one who have the funding cut, right, for the refugees and IDPs because of their policies as donors. Another, while they provide a big support, like millions, to the peace process in Burma. So when we try to link these two issues together, it's kind of separate. They explain that it's separate issue, the peace building and the, refugees who fled from the conflict and still facing the crisis. And also another question that people have is that how about the investment from these countries, and especially the government investment, like for example, like building other dams in Shan State, are invested by some of the like Swiss, like Swiss company, Norwegian SN Power, which is the energy power of the state-owned of Norway, going to build the dam, invested, going to build in one of the very conflict area near Jokme in Nong Keo. That's the middle year, 700 megawatts dam. They said this is the golden opportunities, for investment. So how about not linking these three issues, the conflict, fueling the conflict, refugees who fled from Burma military, from these natural resources and the projects, the investment, and the need to continue to support them and the peace building in Burma as a whole. I think that's something that is missing, in the discussion and the policy development at this time.
Yeah, Marwan, please.
Yeah, Marwan Mark of the Nikkei Asian Review. Two questions, first to Cham Tong and then to Dr. Cynthia. Cham Tong, remember before Thein Sein became president, there was concern about almost Darfur-like scorched earth policies that the ethnic communities had to face at the receiving hands of the Tatmadaw. Do you think that that's exactly what we are finding in the Rakhine, where the Rohingya are victims? And secondly, when Thein Sein's presidency began, groups like yours were asked not to raise the concerns of war crimes because they were asked to give peace and reconciliation a chance. In retrospect, do you regret, or do civil society groups like yours regret being silent? That's my question. And Dr. Cynthia, you talked about malaria. There is concern about drug-resistant malaria on the Thai-Burma border, in Vietnam, and also in Cambodia. So how, as somebody who looks at public health along the Thai-Burma border, how much of a concern is drug-resistant malaria among the people you care for? Thanks.
As I mentioned earlier, the first time when we arrived to the border, malaria is one of the highest, the prevalence in the region, and we have seen that high mortality, morbidity in the region. But over the years, there has been malaria control program through Global Fund and the cross-border collaboration between ethnic organization and some research group, and Ministry of Health also try to improve the malaria posts on the border. So over the years, malaria mortality, morbidity is significantly reduced. And 4 years ago, one of our partner organizations who receiving funding from Gates Foundation and the Global Fund start setting up the malaria posts. More than 1,200 villages malaria posts being set up, and there has been mass drug administration program where they can identify the hotspot malaria area, and empowering the local community is also crucial. And early diagnosis treatment in their village is very crucial for malaria control and prevention drug resistance. But we have seen that the significant reduction in the malaria prevalence and malaria death. But the concern for the drug resistance is the issue, because before that we have seen that many fake medicine coming from India or China. So in Thailand side, or both Thailand and Myanmar, now malaria drugs availability is strictly controlled, and all the medicine or all the malaria posts being provided enough medical supply, so people don't need to go and buy the medicine in the shop. And in Burma, both in Burma and Thailand side now, the drugs and the drugs control policy and the consumer protection law is improving. So we have seen that malaria investment for the malaria control is quite significant. But we still have to concern about, we still see that the mobile population, there are always some increasing mobility and new arrival and some also some new investment going on in the current state or ethnic state. So that means that people will continue mobile. So among the mobile population, controlling malaria or controlling drought resistance is they need to be observed very closely.
Yes, I think what I can say is that it's not new what they do, what the Burma military is doing in Rakhine State. I think it's not new because they have, this is the same Burma military who have committed this before, you know, and until today they still continue to do it, you know, with impunity, and they can get away with it, and with the Scorched Earth campaign, the rape, you know, and etc. So this shows very, very clear that there need to be pressure, you know, on this military government who is still holding so much power. And for the war crimes and crimes against humanity, if maybe we look at the situation now, even the special rapporteurs on human rights situation is not even given access, you know, to go and investigate or to get even the fact, you know, to visit, you know, in some of the like Shan State, you know, area and things like that. So you are at this government, you know, who is even like condemning the special rapporteurs and not allowing them, you know, like to visit. So this is the current situation that Burma is at now.
Hi, my name is Sally Cantor. I'm a freelance journalist. My question is about the cuts to the IDP camps regarding food aid. It seems as though the IDPs are some of the most vulnerable people on the border, as they don't have any recognition legally for their status. So I was wondering how the decision was made to cut off food aid to those communities, and what sort of cuts were also made to refugee camps that were official camps on the border. And since that has been implemented, I'm wondering how the IDPs have responded, and how are they eating? How are they supporting themselves from what you've heard? Thanks.
So the decision was, this was started around 2 years ago, because at that time we thought the funding stream for IDP communities was going to run out, if you like, was likely to run out in 2016 in fact, and then it was in fact extended to 2017. So we'd started talking about it 2 years ago with the community that humanitarian assistance might not continue for the IDP camps. So from that time, essentially what we've been doing is looking at supporting other projects, whether it's around access to clean water, agriculture, things to try and give the IDPs other means to support themselves and their food. So that's been the emphasis on the programs was in this last period, aside from providing some basic humanitarian assistance, was also looking at programs to support livelihoods, so to accelerate livelihoods. And in terms of, I think we have to say for the IDP communities, I mean, it is a very tough message, but they're not confined to a camp in the same way that a refugee is here in Thailand. And they have to look at other ways that the communities around them are also managing. Difficult, I agree. But that was what we did. It was over a 2-year period. It was not a sudden, sharp, tomorrow you have nothing. It was, okay, what can we do to look at other ways to find assistance? And we would support those communities to go out through local community organizations seeking their own funding for projects that will help them to develop their livelihoods. So whether it's for access to clean water, irrigation, that type of project, which is more looking at the longer term rather than seeking assistance for simply rice, which when that rice runs out, what do you do next? So it is trying to, it's trying to shift that thinking into a longer term aspect for those camps. For the refugees, yes, they have been, they have had their assistance reduced. They haven't had it for the last 2 years, but yes, we've gone from since really, I would say, 2009 there have been cuts. We now have 4 different categories. We have 80% who are considered standard who don't get the minimum requirements. They're expected to make up the gap themselves. And we have about 20% of families who are either vulnerable or most vulnerable who receive more assistance. But it's the community decides how they allocate those resources. So it's being graded, and it will go on getting that kind of targeted approach will go on being tightened and tightened as the funding situation gets harder going forward. Yeah, but the decisions there, they certainly weren't made lightly, and they were made with the knowledge and discussion with the community. There have been discussions for a considerable time with the community. But the day it happens is a tough day, and it's a very tough message.
I know the report from the camp, like the Shan camp, that some people like commit suicide because of the frustration they have, and some people just, they rush to do something, to do something, and then they just frustrated, and the house, like they not carefully, and the house was burned, so all the different kind of frustration that is taking place now. So in like one of the camps that we heard, and also the refugees itself in UNCHR, for example, they are also frustrated about that. What the camp committee is doing is that they're trying to come together and trying to raise the concerns, and also trying to say that why they cannot go back yet, and the need to continue for the support for the survival of them while they cannot return. So they have been making some calls and urgent appeals, and seeking support as well, as much as they can. That's what we are trying to do, and working with the camps people for now. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Paul Williams, Associate Member. Quick point of clarification. I understand from what's been said that for the people, there are some people now over 20 years old born in the Thai refugee camps. The Thai government doesn't accept them as Thai citizens. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Just generally, if you're born in Thailand, it doesn't give you the right to citizenship. No. So you get the refugees in the camps. They get registered at birth, but it doesn't entitle them to citizenship. No, absolutely not.
Yes, Jim.
Just wondering, given that you've got a situation here in Thailand where they need workers, they need migrant workers. Has there been any indication, Cham Tong, that you're aware you've got 6,000 people in those IDP camps? Is there any way that the Thai government would give them a green light to work here? And I'm just wondering, whether, Jack and Sally, whether you want to enter into this debate as to, I think, Jack, you said way back right at the end of the Thaksin era, Thaksin was about to have a meeting up in Mae Sot, and one of the things that was going to be debated before the coup ousted him from power was whether the people in the camps would be able to work. Do you think the Thais should shift their policy and allow the people in the camps to work in Thailand?
Essentially, the response from the Thai government is there is a process for people who want to enter the migrant workforce. So it would mean, for refugees, it would mean leaving the camp. It would mean going back to Burma, going through the national verification process, getting documentation, getting a passport, and then coming back into Thailand as a migrant worker. So in that sense, the Thai authorities here say, yes, if people want to leave the camps and become a migrant worker, there is a process for doing it. At this point, they're not at the point of expediting that process so that you could go from the camp and become a migrant worker, but that's not a solution. I mean, when we talk about a future for refugees, it's, yes, to be a migrant worker is perhaps a temporary solution, but it's not a long-term solution. So it's not an effective end, if you like, to the refugee situation to just say everybody could work, because those people don't have a home. They're from Burma. They need that to be recognized as citizens of a country and to exist. So the current process to become a migrant worker, it's got a lot of gray areas, it takes a long time, and it does mean leaving the camp, giving up your, it's made very clear if you were to do that, you would be deregistered from the camp, and you would have to go through a formal process, which is very long-winded, and it means you have to engage with the Burmese authorities to do so.
Interesting comment on the end of the Thaksin era, and it would be interesting to speculate what might have happened had he not been removed at the point he was. In my sort of story, the Thaksin period was not good for the ethnic groups. The vision of exploiting the border natural resources, you know, that was the period, that was what Thaksin was interested in. But nevertheless, in the 2 or 3 months before he was ousted, there was a lot of discussion going on at the policy level on refugees. And the High Commissioner for Refugees came to Thailand in August of 2006. And during those discussions, Thaksin did agree to some very rather enlivened experiments. There was discussion about allowing refugees to go to Thai universities, for example. There was discussion about having controlled access for refugees to Thai work, as well as this discussion about migrant workers being useful. He was removed in September, so we never found out how sincere that was or what might have happened. And of course, then we had we had a military government. Military governments, when they take over, are obsessed with national security, and so any ideas of giving more freedoms and more opportunities to the refugees virtually vanished overnight.
For the Shan refugees, actually they fled the same time with our other refugees, right? The people who were displaced in 1996. So these IDP camps are the ones who, you know, they know that they can go and they can work as migrant workers from the beginning, that they were forced to come and live to work in Thailand. But these are the communities that they hope, you know, to live in this camp in a very difficult condition, but hope that one day they can go back, you know, they see their home there on the other side. So I think that may not be like the option that they are thinking. Also, there's another problem in the migrant workers, in the migrant registration process, is that they have to go through this citizen verification process. So if they come from the village that were deserted or destroyed back in like 1996, there's no place for them to go back and claim that they come from this township or this area. They have to go and find someone who will give them, you know, like who can confirm or say that, verify that they are from Shan state. So who would do that? You know, what are the process and the policy, the whole lot of policy that has to be considered and implement in order for them to actually able to, you know, use these channels. And also there are all other challenges for time registration, you know, the process, the money in it, and everything else. So I think that's a very big challenge for the IDPs.
So we will conclude here. Let's give a big round of applause for the four speakers.